Chapter 27. Flickering torchlight illuminated the rock cavity that served as an office. It smelt of decay and was never warm enough to be comfortable. Sitting at his desk, busily writing, Malleus sniffed, leaned back in his chair, and with a calculatedly calm demeanor asked, "Are you planning to remain in the shadows for the entirety of your visit, Miss Acara? Or would you like to discuss something face-to-face with me?" Hidden in the aforementioned shadows, Kessa had snuck through the various levels of Acara's infamous prison undetected, until she'd finally located the dungeon keeper's office. Concealed in a dark, dank fold of rock just outside the office door, she'd stopped, the conundrum of what exactly she'd planned to do once there hitting her like a ton of bricks. Initially, she'd planned on an epic clash, one where she'd show those who lacked mercy and reverence for life that there was someone willing to oppose them. She wanted to punish them, the dungeon keeper, the king, and anyone else who supported the cruelty that was displayed on the ramparts above the castle gate. The dungeon keeper was first on her blacklist, as he'd brought Augustus and his cronies to their fate. Of course, Kessa would never admit that she was having second thoughts on confronting him once he was within striking distance. He was just so intimidating in person. "I've been more than patient with your invasion. Would you care to tell me why you've infiltrated my dungeon?" Nervously, Kessa stepped into the lambent torchlight, glad to have some distraction from the oppressing atmosphere. The rage that had brought her here hadn't made it past the office door, but it had veiled the foulness of the place, for a bit. Repugnance must have been written plainly on her face because Malleus said, "I had hoped over the course of your lifetime you'd avoid this place. But perhaps it's a good thing for you to see it now. It's a strong deterrent to see what's in store, should you choose a less than savory lifestyle. Wouldn't you agree?" Casting her inhibitions aside, Kessa said glibly, "Well, I certainly can't say I like what you've done with the place." His eyes gleamed in the torchlight as they bored into her. Evidently, he didn't appreciate her facetious response. But then he said with equal glibness, "Can't please everyone, especially criminals. They always seem to expect something for nothing." He stood up, the torches casting his shadow, large and looming, on the rock wall behind him. A heart-rending scream reverberated throughout the dungeon, as if on cue with the looming shadow. It sent shivers up Kessa's spine. Taking a couple of steps towards her, Malleus advised, "Unless you'd like to stay here on a more permanent basis, I suggest you get to the point of your unexpected, unsolicited visit." A mental picture of the heads impaled on spikes like pieces of sausage skewered on toothpicks at a cookout rekindled her anger tenfold. Shaking her head furiously, she hoped to rid herself of the horrendous image. "Augustus and his band were executed." "Your powers of observation never fail to impress," Malleus replied sarcastically. "But they were to be imprisoned, not beheaded. Thieves get prison. Executions are reserved for the worst of the worst and traitors. And they still get a trial. That's the way it's always been." Drawing dangerously close, his piercing dark eyes peering down on her menacingly, he declared, "You're not here to tell me how to do my job, are you?" That would be a grievous waste of our time. Shrinking under his menacing glare, Kessa barely managed to keep her knees from knocking, and mechanically nodded her head, and then, as if realizing her mistake, switched to shaking it. Still, she squeaked, "I guess our justice system is changing now, too." "Since you're suddenly such a champion of justice, Acara, I'll have you know there are far more deserving targets to waste your energy on than Augustus Crow. Trust me." Kessa folded her arms indignantly. This was as much a form of self-defense and self-soothing as it was a sign of displeasure. How could he be so callous? "As fetching as you found his handsome face and roguish character, he was not a man known for scruples or respectable associations." Kessa's mouth fell open, but before she could protest Malleus's allegation, he continued, "But I think you deduced as much on your own, as evidenced by your assistance in thwarting his escape attempt. Don't question the rectitude of your actions, because the end result isn't to your preference." Turning on his heel, he headed for his desk, saying, "If there's nothing else." Although his dismissal was obvious, Kessa found the tenacity to stay. "When you called him by his full name, Augustus Crow, it shocked and humiliated him." Malleus's gait slowed. He turned his head to the side, but didn't wholly grant her a backward glance. "Why?" "Some of us get so caught up in role play that we forget or lose who we truly are." Here he looked at her. "It's jarring when we're unexpectedly reminded." Frustrated by the cleverly crafted response that told her little, and equally emboldened by her curiosity, Kessa took a couple steps closer to the desk and was about to press further when the office door swung open and a harried man burst in. Upon spotting Kessa, his already red face reddened further, and he advanced, pointing his sword at her. If his face wasn't so red, he'd actually be rather attractive, with his black curls, muscular build, and austere features. Malleus pulled out his pocket watch and glanced meaningfully at it, then asked, "What tipped you off, Simon?" "Deepest apologies, sir. The prisoners were whispering about an intruder." "Ah, well, if the prisoners knew before we did, doesn't look well on us, does it? I suggest a vigorous revamping of our security detail. I think I will handle that personally." The man, Simon, swallowed hard and shook his head back and forth, despite replying, "Yes, Lord Fane." His hazel eyes zeroing in on Kessa like he was wishing he could skewer her head on a pike, Simon jabbed his sword tip closer to her. Another wild scream reverberated through the prison, adding to the uneasy tension that hung in the air. The drips of water pooling onto the floor that were previously ignored now seemed deafening. Seeing that the dungeon keeper showed no interest in asking his subordinate to lower his sword or back off, Kessa cleared her throat, hoping to elicit some response. Not looking up from his paperwork, Malleus said, "Miss Acara, you've done us a favor in illustrating that there are holes in our security. Thank you." "Miss Acara?" Simon repeated, his surprise evident by his tone and how wide his eyes grew. His sword lowering, he gasped, "Call me a dung heap, and rightly so. I didn't know the lady was your sister-in-law. Forgive me, miss. Sir." Giving him a sideways glance, Malleus declared,
I wasn't expecting you to know her. Miss Acara has never been here before. But since she's so interested in our dungeons, enough to come uninvited, I believe we must indulge her. A solitary cell on level 3 should suffice, Simon.
Simon blinked, and his mind and body seemed at odds for a moment when he physically jerked toward Kessa. Kessa was positive the man was so used to obeying Fane's orders that it was almost automatic. The hesitation was his mind questioning whether he'd heard the order correctly. He wasn't alone in that. Kessa took a step back, questioning what she'd just heard, like Simon. Melius's eyes, glittering darkly, rose to Simon, demanding to know what he was waiting for.
You want me to put Mr. Cora in a cell on level 3, sir? Yes, Melius confirmed. I thought level 4 would be a bit much, but if you think level 4 is better... No, Simon sputtered in a mortified tone.
You're joking, Kessa cried incredulously, pulling her arm away from Simon.
I'm not. I cannot condone breaking into the dungeon any more than I can condone breaking out.
He looked down his nose at her and stated the obvious.
I'm sure you realize I'd have complete mayhem on my hands if I allowed either.
Seriously? You're worried about people breaking into the dungeon? Enough to cause mayhem? I think you've been inhaling the fumes in here for far too long. Time for some fresh air, Lord Fane. Simon smacked the back of her head, hard enough to censure, but not to hurt.
No one speaks to Lord Fane that way, he growled. Not when I'm around.
Kessa's brow puckered, and her lips formed a tight line as she rubbed her head where he'd struck her. She was shocked Simon had it in him to hit a girl, a relative of his boss, no less. His devotion to Lord Fane ran deeper than she'd first supposed.
Thank you, Simon. Miss Acara, your motives aside, another might wish to break in order to break someone out, or to get revenge, or to just plain cause chaos. Do you see why I'm concerned?
Feeling foolish, Kessa chided herself for her narrow view and murmured, Not much to be concerned about. Breaking in wasn't easy.
Melius looked at her critically. That gives me little comfort.
Simon grasped Kessa's arm and said waggishly,
Let's go, inmate.
Kessa briefly considered ripping her arm free and darting out of the dungeon, but she thought better of it. She realized that the dungeon keeper would ultimately have his way, and fighting would only make things worse for her. Likewise with bitter complaining or pleading. She didn't want to degrade herself further anyway. No, she had to face the consequences of her actions. And that realization caused her head to ache far worse than Simon's smack.
Simon.
At Fane's beckoning, Simon stopped and gave him his full attention.
Yes, sir.
Search her. His body stiffening as if it was expecting a blow, Simon gawped at his boss, and once more clarified,
You want me to search Miss Acara, sir? Yes, she's probably armed.
As if unconvinced, Simon didn't move. Exercising excellent patience, Melius stated,
We search all our prisoners, male or female, prior to locking them up, Simon. This is nothing new.
For the second time during this encounter, Kessa saw Simon's face go beet red. She gathered that in his 25 or so years, Simon had rarely had to search women, and that he was uncomfortable doing so. The fact that she was his boss's sister-in-law didn't make matters any easier. Deciding to make it easy for him, Kessa lifted her arms. She'd been training that day, so she wasn't heavily armed anyway. Clearing his throat and glancing warily at the dungeon keeper, Simon searched her. Surprise evident on his red face, Simon removed the hidden dagger from her boot and the miniature throwing knives from her waist cincher, and the dagger concealed in her thigh pocket.
"Leave them with me,"
Malleus instructed, signaling toward his desk.
"You'll get them back,"
he answered Kessa's unvocalized protest. His adequate search finished, Simon urged her out of the office before Malleus could direct him to do anything else. Earlier, as she'd snuck through the levels of the dungeon, seeking Malleus's office, Kessa had avoided being seen, and, in her rage, had avoided seeing much as well. Now, thanks to Simon's slow meander along the abysmal labyrinth that was the 4th floor, and up a staircase to the 3rd floor, she saw more than she'd ever wanted to. The solid, impenetrable rock atmosphere itself was oppressive, but then there was the almost constant stench, strong enough to make one gag, and the unidentifiable liquids oozing down parts of the walls into sludgy puddles or seeping through grimy gaps in the floor. Groans, moans, yelling, and the occasional terrorized scream comprised the dungeon's main soundtrack, accompanied by the rattle of chains and intermittent, very annoying, clanking sounds. The lack of light contributed to the gloom and doom atmosphere, too. Light was so sparse, Kessa often had to squint to see, and she tripped more than once on the uneven rock floor. The lighting improved once they arrived at a more populated cell block. So did the footing. It was more worn. The corridor of the central 3rd floor cell block stretched on for several meters, ending in a stone wall, equipped with several manacles and chains. At the other end of the corridor, where they'd just rounded the corner, was a large cast-iron oven, its chimney slithering through the ceiling like a black serpent, and next to the oven was a locked coal box. The heat radiating from the oven alleviated the chill somewhat, but not enough to make the 3rd floor's temperature hospitable. Alongside the oven was an alcove with one small table, a jug, 2 small cups, and 2 chairs. A couple of hooks dangling keys hung above the table, and 2 wound-up whips hung on a spike that was hammered into the side wall of the alcove. An alert guard stood next to the hooks. Kessa reckoned he kept watch over the keys. Simon and the guard exchanged information before the guard handed him a key from one of the hooks, and Simon nudged Kessa to continue walking. Along the left side of the passage were several doors with small, barred windows. Kessa had no idea if these rooms were used for interrogation, punishment, or if prisoners that didn't play nice were locked inside. A peek through one of the small windows would have cured her ignorance, but Kessa didn't have the opportunity, nor did she need it. Seeing her curiosity, Simon told her those rooms were reserved for the sick. The other side of the hallway was more complicated. Cells with thick iron bars were either boxed together or completely separated by walkways. Most were heavily occupied. Prisoners glared out at her from behind those thick iron bars, grasping them weakly. The coldness in their eyes was as unsettling as the cuts and contusions on their bodies. Many of them jeered at her, and several made crude remarks. 2 guards patrolling the hallway slammed clubs against the bars. The resulting sound rung in Kessa's ears, drowning out the insults. At least she knew the source of the annoying clanking sound. The guards' glares were almost as unsettling as those of the inmates. They knew she brought a whole mess of trouble along with her, and not just trouble with the inmates. By now, word would have spread that their security had failed, that she was the intruder, and that the dungeon keeper was not impressed. Trouble, to be sure. Give us a break, will ya? A bald prisoner who was missing several teeth pleaded with a guard as he threatened to whack the bars with his club again. We don't lay eyes on pretty things much anymore. Let us enjoy it. This is a dungeon, Hamish. There's no such thing as enjoyment. The guard qualified his response with a slam of his club against the bar next to Hamish's head. You only have yourself to blame. In another cell, a pile of prisoners shoving and bickering over who had the best view were violently jostled aside as a fiendish boar of a man rammed his way to the front. I could smell her from his office, he announced gruffly. Grasping the bars, he pressed his ugly mug against them and sniffed the air like the aforementioned animal. Cyrenian roses. One sky-blue eye roved over her figure as he licked his pale lips. His other eye was milky white. A long scar, starting at his hairline and ending mid-cheek, ran through it. She looks as good as she smells, too. Shut it, Ivor, the guards snapped in unison. But they didn't approach his cell as they had the others. Ivor paid them no mind. Come here, Rose, he chortled. We can be cellmates. Without a backwards glance, he used his elbow to knock out a fellow inmate who was planning to strike him from behind. Ivor stomped on the fellow's head a couple times before chuffing and snorting wildly. Instinctively, Simon pushed Kessa farther away from Ivor's cell, and Ivor taunted them, and then demanded, Tell me your real name, Rose. Aren't you going to do anything for him? Kessa whispered to Simon, indicating the wounded inmate at Ivor's feet. If he dies, we'll move the body. Eventually. Otherwise, nope. One of the guards who'd overheard her answered, He asked for it. Most prisoners know better than to challenge Ivor. Most guards, too, I'll wager, Kessa said softly. Simon inclined his head. Nasty sort. I told Lord Fane he ought to be on the 4th floor. He's a killer. Despite her trepidation, Kessa felt a flicker of the indignation that had brought her to the dungeon in the first place. And they execute Augustus. That's because he threatened the king's best revenue stream. Simon's voice was now as low as Kessa's, and his demeanor soured. Aquina has the highest tax rate thanks to the mint. If it weren't for their lord, that Aguillon fella, the king have his mitts on their entire treasury. Kessa was too riled to fully acknowledge the way her stomach flipped at the mention of Pantheus. In other words, you can rape, murder, and pillage commoners, but if you so much as look at the king or his money wrong, you die. This was not a revelation for Kessa or her companion, but it felt good to express it. You said it. As if remembering where and who he was, Simon shook himself and cleared his throat. How come you don't put Ivor in a cell by himself? Kessa asked, glancing back at the felon. That would be too humane, Simon answered snarkily, though the attitude was not directed at her. Besides, the few solitary cells we have are usually reserved for female prisoners, when we have any on the 3rd floor, which isn't often. He gave her a reproachful look that demanded to know if she was proud of herself for the honor. He didn't speak again until they reached 3 small, empty cells that lined the wall next to the manacles. Yanking the door to one of them open, He ignored the squealing hinges, an all too familiar sound, and beckoned her to enter.
"Your accommodations for the evening."
Sulkily, Kessa stepped inside, thanking Simon derisively. The cell backed onto solid rock and was the size of her closet at home. It was entirely bare, except for a ratty blanket, a pile of straw, about as inviting as straw that's been in a horse's stall for a week, and half a bucket of murky water. At least, she hoped it was water, but noticing the absence of a chamber pot, she deduced that wasn't the case and retched. The disgusting surroundings would have been sufficient to curb any other newcomer's appetite, not Kessa's. "Food?" she asked, grasping the bars. "When's dinner? I'm famished."
"So is every prisoner in this place."
One guard cut in quietly, his words meant only for her and Simon. She was sneaking about while dinner was being served. Busy time, mealtime, probably a factor in her pulling the wool over our eyes.
"Well, there you have it. You missed the evening meal,"
Simon reiterated.
"But don't fret. You'll be here for breakfast,"
he added with an acidic chuckle. The statement didn't amuse Kessa. Simon, ironically, wished her a good night and, along with the guard, sauntered down the hallway and out of sight. Kessa sighed and sat cross-legged on the floor, wincing at how cold it felt. Checking for guards or spying eyes, Kessa gingerly reached down her shirt and plucked out her second peach. She'd stuffed it there when she'd left headquarters. Simon's search hadn't been thorough enough to find it. He'd only lightly patted the chest area. Cautiously and quietly, she munched on the fruit until an ear-splitting clank behind her head startled her. She peered up into the face of an indignant guard.
"No outside food allowed."
He held out his hand, waiting for her to place the half-eaten peach into it. Kessa held on to the fruit tightly for a moment, and then defiantly took another bite, explaining that she'd missed dinner and didn't sign up for torture. The prisoners who'd caught wind of what was happening cheered and jeered, making remarks about what an apt fruit for her to be eating, what they'd like to see her do with her peach, what they'd like to do with her peach, or other things they'd like to bite into. Impatiently, the guard slammed his club into the bars again and called for silence, threatening to get the whip if he wasn't obeyed. Kessa wasn't sure if he was referring to her giving him the peach or the prisoners being quiet, or both. Regardless, she didn't think causing more trouble was wise, and she didn't like the idea of being whipped or seeing anyone else being whipped. Sneaking another large bite, she petulantly handed the guard the delicious fruit. Smiling down on her maliciously, the guard finished the peach and threw the pit into the bucket in her cell, before laughing and turning on his heel to continue his watch. Kessa groaned and kicked her feet out in frustration. 5 minutes or so later, from the cell across and down the way from hers, she overheard a high-pitched, screechy voice ask, "Can we get her, Ivor? Can we?" Since Kessa was the lone her currently on the 3rd floor, it was obvious who they were talking about. The screechy voice owner's enthusiasm gave her the chills. Naturally, she didn't like the idea of anyone getting her, but these criminals took that dislike up a few notches. "Is this the opportunity we've waited for, Ivor? Is it?"
"Shh, you fool."
There was a long pause after Ivor's reproof. Finally, he answered,
"Wait until he has gone for the night."
The emphasis surrounding the he in Ivor's reply left no uncertainty that he was referring to the dungeon keeper. Kessa's shiver had nothing to do with the cold temperature. It didn't take a spy to deduce Ivor was up to something, and that her arrival had an impact on that. The only two comforts she had were knowing that Fane had to answer to her sister, and, logically, for the sake of his own skin, wouldn't want her harmed, and secondly, that this was his dungeon, which meant stringent rules, regulations, and competency. She gave no credence to the fact that she'd snuck through the dungeon, a detail that would normally throw the guards' competency into question. It wouldn't be an entirely fair assessment of their abilities. She had, after all, been trained better than any burglar. Kessa smacked her leg, cursing her stupidity. When would she learn not to indulge the whims of her emotions? Just because she was enraged, and just because she could challenge dungeon security, didn't mean that she should. Although it made her feel queasy inside, she had to agree with Fane's decision to lock her up. Simon's arrival in the office had made that outcome inevitable. By breaking in, she'd basically challenged the dungeon keeper's authority, and there was no way he could leave that unchecked, sister-in-law or not. She hoped, as he must have, that this foray might teach her a valuable lesson. If this punishment didn't knock some sense into her, Thomas's reaction, when he found out, certainly would. If she didn't die tonight, he was going to kill her. Leaning her head back against the bars, she focused on counting mice and rats. It was far better than self-flagellation or eavesdropping on the unoriginal, often lewd, conversations of her fellow prisoners. A couple hours later, a hush fell over the third floor. Only remnants of muted noise could be heard from other locations in the dungeon. Kessa's ears, unused to the quiet, perked up, as well as the hairs on the back of her neck. What had triggered the sudden hush? Turning around, Kessa discovered a host of prisoners staring at her like coyotes eyeing trapped prey. Ivor was prominent, his good eye piercing her through the dim distance between them. Disturbed by the unanimous and creepy attention, Kessa jumped to her feet, retreating until her back hit cold, hard rock. A futile but understandable reaction. She wanted as much space between them as possible. Glancing down the corridor, she wondered where the guards were. Until that moment, the hallways had constantly been patrolled. She'd actually began to question how she'd managed to sneak all the way down to her brother-in-law's office without being seen by a single guard, even if it was during mealtime. It spoke to her skill, but right now she was too perturbed to pat herself on the back. She took a shaky breath, consoling herself with the idea that maybe the patrol thinned at nighttime, or an issue had arisen on one of the other levels, or there was a shift change. The guards would be back at any moment. Surely. "A little birdie told us you broke into the dungeon," Ivor said, breaking the silence. "Told us you're related to him, too. Useful things to know." Not good. Definitely not good. Kessa tried to remain calm, reminding herself that two sturdy locks stood between Ivor and her. To curb her nervousness, she reassessed the situation. It hadn't taken her long to realize that Ivor only used pronouns when referring to Lord Fane. This hinted at the felon's deep loathing or crippling fear of the dungeon keeper. These feelings could inspire irrationality and desperation, but she'd previously determined that Ivor was no blowhard, nor did she think he was stupid.
He had a plan, and it wasn't good for her or the guards. Anticipating this plan previous to its enactment was her best defense now. The guards didn't carry keys or weapons other than clubs, and they didn't react to prisoners in any sort of danger. So a distraction snatch and grab wasn't plausible. Perhaps Ivor and his cronies had bribed a guard, though Kessa doubted this, considering Fane vetted his guards personally, and she had to admit, begrudgingly, he was an excellent judge of character. Plus, she didn't believe there was a soul in the kingdom who'd want to betray a man like Malleus Fane. The idea itself was terrifying. So, what was Ivor's plan? Her eyes met his in a clash of wills that was almost palpable. "What's all this?" a guard demanded as he rounded the corner. "Jas, you see this?" The sound of chair legs scratching rock preceded the key guard, Jas, poking his head out from the alcove. So, there had been a guard on duty. He'd just been out of view. Kessa didn't know if she could forgive sitting out of view while on duty, even if a majority of the prisoners were asleep and the charge was simply a key. It was risky, not something she would have done. Apparently, the other guard felt the same, hence drawing Jas's attention. The prisoners, all except Ivor, backed away from the bars. "A little out of your league, don't you think, Ivor?" Jas asked, noticing the inmate's unnerving focus on Kessa. "Definitely out of your reach," the other guard said. Finished his sweep, the guard had walked far enough away to miss Ivor's retort of, "Not for long." Kessa held out for an impressive duration, but even the impending threats of the third floor couldn't keep her eyes from drooping as the night wore on. In her defense, she was still sore and exhausted from training with Thomas, sprinting through the streets, and sneaking into the dungeon, none of which were easy feats. "Wake up, Rose Girl," was not a pleasant way to be awakened, nor was peering up through sleepy lids to see Ivor standing over her, a telltale scowl on his face. She opened her mouth to scream when he grabbed her throat, choking the scream to a harmless gurgle. With his insistence, Kessa cautiously rose to her feet. "Scream and I'll crush your throat like a walnut." This threat was as convincing as it was menacing, particularly when he gripped her throat with both hands. Next to him stood a scrawny skeleton of a man who absolutely shuddered with perverted delight. He held one of the guard's clubs in his hand, and since his nose was crooked and bloody, Kessa figured he'd battled a guard for it. How he'd managed to overcome a guard, being as slight and weak as he was a conundrum. Just outside of her cell stood the rest of Ivor's cellmates, 6 in all, glancing around cagily. "Let me touch her, Ivor," the man with the damaged nose pleaded in the screechy voice Kessa recognized from earlier in the evening. The other inmates seconded the request with ones of their own. While they were distracted, Kessa kicked out, her shin successfully hitting the mark. Screechy Voice's hands flew to his crotch, and he doubled over with a wretched groan. "Feisty, aren't you, Rose?" Ivor laughed. Feeling his grip loosen with his laughter, Kessa thrust her shoulder and arm toward Ivor's outstretched arms in an attempt to break his hold on her throat. He was too strong, and she didn't have enough leverage to outright break his hold, but her arm position was perfect for a backhand. His head snapped sideways with the impact. The 6 inmates hissed, surging forward. Ivor's rage was obvious. He closed in, his grip tightening. Hoping to deny him time to react with that rage, she switched to elbowing him multiple times. She wanted to knock him out, down, away, anything,
come what may. Her unfortunate position inhibited much of her strength, and on her fourth blow, Ivor evaded her elbow, rammed her painfully against the rock wall, and punched her in the stomach, effectively knocking the wind out of her. Malice in his eyes, club in his hand, the bloodied, screechy-voiced man came at her, his murderous intent clear. Ivor blocked him. All in good time, Bert. Remember, she's our ticket out of here. We've got to move, Ivor, one of the escapees said anxiously. Agreeing, Ivor wiped away some of the blood trickling from his nose. His battered face had started to swell red and as angry as Ivor himself. He wrapped a powerful arm ruthlessly around Kessa's throat and swiveled her to face the exit of her cell. Walk, Rose. Get us out of here alive, and I might just let you live. Highly unlikely, Kessa thought, but there was little she could do. Ivor's vice grip, his troop of felons, and the confinement of the corridor made escape just as unlikely as Ivor's intent to let her live. Most of the third floor was asleep. Any prisoners that were awake watched quietly, hoping their silence would earn them freedom. She couldn't see any guards. That was strange, since the hallway was regularly patrolled. She'd expected to see at least one dead or unconscious. Slowly, her legs trembling, she took a step forward, and then another, and another, until she was halfway down the corridor. Ivor's cell door was wide open, and down the hall a set of keys was missing from the hooks. How in Acara had they managed this? Skeleton Bert, with his screechy voice, took a couple steps in front of her. The back of his head and his back were scraped and bloody, like he'd been dragged on gravel. His shirt, torn and just as bloody, hung off his bones precariously. She added his injuries together, and an inkling of how they'd done it formed in her mind. She surveyed the back of their cell for confirmation of her theory. 4 guards, armed with whips, rounded the corner. Ivor squeezed until he was choking Kessa. The shortest of the 4 guards cracked his whip toward the fugitives and yelled, "Return to your cells at once!" "Stay back," Ivor bellowed as he swung Kessa back and forth like a rag doll, "or I'll snap her neck." Kessa felt as though he already had. The guards looked at one another, seemingly baffled by his threat, and it occurred to her that they didn't care. Oh, she was done for. A quiet, menacing voice sounded from behind the convicts. "And what do you do, Ivor, once you've killed her and lost your leverage?" 180ing, Ivor slammed his back on the northern wall. All Ivor's and Bert's companions had been rendered unconscious, or dead, it was difficult to tell, and lined up against the northern wall like sitting stone gargoyles. If the sight weren't so welcome to Kessa, she would have found it very disconcerting. "You're not supposed to be here," Ivor stammered at the dungeon keeper, who stood only a few meters away. If not for the chokehold, Kessa would have laughed out loud. Ivor was positively quaking in his boots, and his hold on her loosened as a result. Not one to pass up such an opportunity, she turned her head to the side and jammed her elbow into his ribs. Her chin successfully blocking his arm from her neck, Kessa struck her heel on the top of his foot as hard as she could. Ivor squealed, and, for a fleeting minute, it was unclear what his next move was. Calling her an expletive, followed by wildcat, he shoved her away ere she could do more damage. She sprawled forward, and the guards pounced, wrestling them both to the ground. Although unhappy about being tackled and pinned in a painful armlock, Kessa was relieved. She was free of Ivor and his ilk, and their escape attempt was foiled. Lifting Kessa off the ground, the guard nodded his affirmation at Fane when he instructed him to keep a hold of her. Her captor's hold was a little too tight for comfort, especially since she was sore and banged up. But Kessa didn't struggle. Truth be told, even if she wanted to struggle, she didn't have the energy. Besides, she was content to watch as each of the offenders were thoroughly searched. As expected, the missing keys were found on Ivor, who'd stuffed them in his boot. Their searches concluded, the guards clapped irons on the prisoner's wrists and ankles. The heavy and constrictive manacling was met with several groans, to which the dungeon keeper responded, "Just one of the consequences of your escape attempt." He put such an ominous emphasis on his wording that the prisoners visibly paled and stopped griping at once. After a personal inspection from Lord Fane, they were locked up in different cells. Some were even taken to other floors. In the end, none of them were placed in the same cell, and the cell they'd originally occupied was left vacant. A search of the third floor revealed 2 unconscious guards with bloody head wounds. They'd been locked into one of the northern rooms. Once revived, they were thoroughly questioned. One of the guards confessed he'd been inspecting a torch that had mysteriously gone out when he'd felt a sharp blow to the back of his head, and all went black. Jas also experienced an unexpected bam, knocking him unconscious. Both guards hung their heads in shame as they admitted they couldn't offer any information on how the prisoners had got the better of them. They weren't alone in their ignorance. None of the other guards offered an explanation on how the prisoners escaped either. "I know you warned us that Ivor and his crew were up to something, and to be extra diligent, Lord Fane. We failed. We deserve to be punished." Mouth slightly agape, Kessa stared at the guards, flabbergasted by their admission. Their honesty and willingness to take responsibility for their failure surprised her. In her experience, most people were anxious to pass the buck. "As human beings often do," Malleus replied, leaving it unclear which of the 2 statements he was replying to. Kessa figured it was both. People did fail. A lot. And it wouldn't shock her to learn that her brother-in-law believed that humans often deserved to be punished. Miss Dacora's presence was obviously a catalyst. On the bright side, her arrival was... The dungeon keeper paused to look at her. Convenient. Kessa rolled her eyes and slumped slightly against the guard's hold. "Bait!" she cried. "You used me as bait!" Malleus ignored her accusation. "Did you witness how they got out of their cells and into yours, Miss Dacora?" "No. I woke up to them. But I have a theory." "Ah, as do I. I'm curious if our theories align. Please share your observations." All eyes were suddenly on her. She was equally surprised. The great dungeon keeper interested in her observations? That was, well, unexpected, to say the least. Kessa hesitated, considering the consequences of revealing her deductive reasoning skills. But then anyone who'd snuck into the Cyrenian dungeon was bound to have some. And they all knew she was Equestria's sister. Equestria had excellent deductive skills, too. Bert, the skeleton man, squeezed between the rock wall and the bars at the back corner of the cell. As to the rest, I can only speculate. Since everyone was still looking at her expectantly, she continued. He doused a couple torches, probably by peeing on them. Kessa made a disgusted face as she divulged this theory. He lay in wait until you arrived. She indicated the guard who'd inspected the torch. He stole your club, knocked you out, which made more sense than Bert overcoming a guard as she'd initially thought. Snuck down the hall to ambush you, she pointed to Jas. Once you were both unconscious, he grabbed the keys, released Ivor and his fellow prisoners, Then they unlocked my cell.
Seriously? You want us to believe Bert squeezed out of his cell? A guard asked skeptically.
Giving him an imperious look, she responded, "You can see how the rock has been worn down over time. Bits of rock they chipped away recently are still scattered on the floor. See? How else would you explain his scrapes and scratches? Or his broken nose?"
She glanced at Malleus, almost apologetically.
"And they did all this right under your noses."
"Indeed," the dungeon keeper conceded, not giving any hints whether he was impressed with her analysis or if their theories had aligned. The guards moved to assess the rear of the cell, and Kessa wasn't surprised when they confirmed her explanation.
"My presence was, as you said, a convenience. I was the stimulus to push Ivor into action, as well as a distraction," Kessa said to Malleus.
"And his undoing," he divulged.
"If Ivor and his buddies had left me alone, they'd probably have succeeded in escaping the dungeon."
"Perhaps."
Malleus ordered the 2 injured guards to the infirmary and the others back to work.
"But not in escaping me."
Kessa shook the guard off easily. He practically let her go, and grinned at her brother-in-law. "I saved you a manhunt."
Eyes twinkling, Malleus declared, "I could argue I saved myself."
Her face scrunched with her struggle to dispute him. She enabled his plan, but it was still Malleus's plan. She hadn't even known about it, and she couldn't prove that Lord Fane wouldn't have found another way to prevent Ivor's escape. Since she couldn't outright refute him, she switched to the next best thing. "You put me in danger."
"You snuck into a dungeon, Miss Acara. You put yourself in danger."
"You kept me here. As bait. My sister won't like the risk you took."
"We'll have to ask her."
Kessa's face scrunched again. Great Athelos, he was infuriating. He'd called her bluff. Of course, she wanted to mention this ordeal to Equestria, about as much as she wanted Ivor to escape.
"It's time to go home."
Motioning the guard hovering next to her to return to duty, Malleus whirled and started down the hallway towards the stairs.
"Are you coming, Acara? Or did you really want to stay for breakfast?"
Even the mention of food wasn't enough to entice her to stay for another minute. She doubted she'd enjoy the food served in a dungeon anyway. The dungeon keeper navigated the dark streets at an alarming speed. Her leg muscles complaining, Kessa cursed inwardly. It felt just like skittering after Thomas. Although she really had no idea what time it was, Kessa guessed that dawn wasn't far off. Oh, how she longed for her comfortable bed. Her body was aching all over. Her stomach was sore from where Ivor punched her, but not nearly as sore or swollen as her neck. It hurt to swallow. She was in enough pain that her empty stomach barely dented consciousness, and that was saying something. She contemplated sending a message to Thomas that she wouldn't be attending training that day. How in Acara was she supposed to wrestle or train in her state? Alas, she knew how Thomas would react to such a missive. Negatively. He'd probably come to her house and drag her out by her hair, especially when he caught wind of the dungeon escapade. Soreness and pain were no excuse. There had been times when her muscles were aching so badly that she could hardly move, yet she still showed up, as expected. Once her muscles had warmed up, it wasn't so bad, but the effort of getting there, yeesh. She realized she'd fallen so far behind that the light from Malleus's torch no longer lit her path. Stretching her eyes wide didn't help her see better. No surprise there. Too proud to call her brother-in-law, she picked her way along the path, cursing his inconsiderate pace. From the shadows, she heard an unnerving sound. Instinctively, her hand flew to where her dagger normally sat, but it wasn't there. Malleus had never returned her weapons. A couple meters to her right, she saw what looked like a pair of small glowing rings emerge from the blackness. Kessa felt a tremor rip down her spine and the hairs on her neck prickle. There was something very unnatural about the golden glow, but she wasn't going to hang around to find out what it was. She started running. She ended up flat on her face. Climbing back on her feet, she jumped, startled by Malleus, who was standing next to her. Her heart pounding, she looked behind her. The hairs on her neck were still prickling. Seeing nothing except the root she'd tripped on, she rounded on her brother-in-law. "Why'd you have to go so fast?" she demanded.
"What spooked you?"
he asked, paying no heed to her irritability. "Huh?" Since he was the last person in the kingdom she'd ever confide in, she feigned ignorance.
"You're very pale, and your heart rate is high."
Eyebrows furrowing, Kessa wondered how he knew about her heart rate.
"Well,"
he insisted, "can we just go home, please?"
"Miss Acara."
Judging by his tone, she knew he wouldn't drop the subject until she'd answered him. If she remained equally stubborn, it would be dawn before they got home. "I don't know what it was," she said. "I saw glowing ring-like things."
"Who goes there?"
A pair of night watchmen rounded a corner and pointed their torches forward.
"Oh, Lord Fane. Beg your pardon. Long shift, sir?" "Yes," Malleus answered. "How are things?" "Nothing to report, sir. A fairly quiet evening." "That's good. I hope it continues that way." "Thank you, sir. Have a good rest of your night." The guards continued their patrol. Malleus waved Kessa on. "Shall we?" Despite the interruption, Kessa expected to be grilled further about what she'd seen, but Malleus no longer seemed interested. Perhaps he thought she was imagining things or hallucinating. Regardless, he didn't ask her any more questions, or even speak to her again until they arrived at the house. Malleus placed the torch in the porch receptacle and unlocked the front door. "I didn't imagine it, you know," Kessa said as she passed him, stepping over the threshold. Giving her a cryptic look, he said, "Sleep well, Miss Acara. You need your rest."